Hello everyone, welcome to a very packed Sala dei Notari. Well, it's a real pleasure for me and all of us to have Inna Shevchenko here with us. As you will all know, she is one of the founding members of Femen, and it's a very interesting time to be talking to her because, of course, we've seen a lot of changes in the, I suppose we can call it feminist movement. I guess a lot of people will call it different things. In the past few years, we've seen the start of the Me Too movement, starting in the United States and then truly moving across the world. We've had a lot of panels here in Perugia, Me Too in Egypt, Me Too in India. So we've seen women becoming more aware, often more connected because of social media. I suppose on the downside, we've also seen some political entities around the world that perhaps don't have the equal rights of women at heart as they should be. So certainly a lot of topics to talk with Inna about. So Inna, first of all, welcome. I know it's your first time in Perugia, so it's great to have you. Tell us a little bit about the very start, because of course you started Femen when you were really young and in Ukraine, which is your home country. Tell us more.
Right. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for this full room. I'm very, very excited and very thankful and very touched and empowered by this big crowd, which is always very important for activists like myself. Going back to the beginning of our activism in Ukraine, I have to say that it's been already 10 years that this fight goes on, and I think that it's rather something that we can be proud of, because it's always very difficult to maintain a fight throughout years, and especially a feminist fight, as we have a lot of enemies, and I think we're going to discuss that further in our conversation. But you know, our fight began in the context and in the country where nobody was ever interested to listen to women. Everybody was interested to look at women, to observe their body, to use their body, but never hear women's voices, never listen to their demands, to their needs. And nobody was interested to listen to us too. And we were this first generation after the Orange Revolution, the first democratic uprising in Ukraine in 2004. And we were aware that our destiny can be different. It can be different from the destiny of our mothers, of all the generation of women in our country. And we said that, well, there are two solutions, two ways for us to go. Either keep silence and accept, as our mothers had to accept, or at least try to change something, at least try to demand that our voices will be heard. We began with big demonstrations, writing huge amount of numbers and words and slogans and data on our big banners. We were ignored. Nobody would ever even stop to read what was written on those banners. And we understood that, well, we have to make people listen to us in other way. We have to make them notice our messages. And they were always interested to look at our body, to use it. And we said, now we're going to use our bodies to make them listen to us. And so we transformed our body into this political poster, into our own democracy wall, like I like to say, into our loudspeaker. And we wrote our messages across our chest and said, now my body will no longer be sexual whenever you want it, but now it will be political whenever I decide it to be political. And that's how our fight began.
And so you decided to use your body and to turn it into a political tool. What was the reaction to that, both positive in the sense that you did get attention, but also negative?
Of course, the reactions were very controversial, same as our act was rather controversial, right? And probably one of the most common first reactions were, go back to kitchen. Everybody felt obliged to point us woman's place. And that was once again this kind of a revelation that indeed we did something right. We saw that the immediate reaction were the arrests and even some kind of administrative and criminal charges, and politicians started making comments, male politicians started making comments about our obscenity and our wrong acts. Yet we asked ourselves, whenever before woman's naked body was disturbing so many men in this country. And we understood that the clincher was that we now placed woman's body in a political context. And these men saw that now this body is no longer there to please them, but rather to maybe irritate them, or to question them, or to demand something from them, or to oppose them. And so we understood that indeed woman's body has always been in the center of her oppression, of our oppression, and therefore we said it's going to now be in the center of our own self-liberation. We placed it in our own self-liberation, and of course we received numerous reactions. And you know, if at the beginning it was just comments and kind of maybe insulting and violent reactions from our opponents, of course there were a lot of support too. Yet talking about the negative reactions, it all escalated with time, as they understood that we're not planning to shut our mouths, that we're not planning to stop, and that was not just one scream from inside of our hearts and souls. And they saw that we indeed organized as a bigger and bigger movement. The movement was getting momentum, and we became a legitimate part of political context in Ukraine and then later in Eastern Europe. And well, among the experience that I had were, of course, numerous arrestations, torture in Belarus, kidnapping and torture in Belarus by the KGB, being forced into exile in 2012, surviving a terrorist attack in 2015. It's just my experience, but there are hundreds of other feminine activists who also had similar or even more difficult experience. And you know, I always try to use this opportunity to speak directly to people, like right now, to you. Whatever you can think about this tactic of taking off the top, screaming slogans in public space, you might think, you know, you can think different things, and you can oppose it or support it, but let's agree and that taking off your top, writing slogan across your chest, and going in a public space with a poster and screaming out your slogan does not deserve such a reaction as being put to jail, being threatened to be killed, to be raped, to be burned alive, to be kidnapped, and to be tortured. You know, I think that the reaction we received was always very disproportional. And it once again reveals a lot about our society and our society's fear of women who finally can take over and speak out.
We will definitely talk in more detail later about the tactics, you know, the controversy around it, and ultimately how effective they've been. But I think it's really important to paint a picture, you know, of where you come from, of where this all started. So Ukraine, because a lot of your acts, the Femen acts, you know, most of us will know the ones that took place in the West. But I think it's important to paint a picture of the situation in Ukraine. So apart from the issue of women, just free speech in Ukraine at the time as was. And again, if you could tell us the difficulties, and as you've already hinted, you know, I think you're only 28 and, you know, you've had your share of trouble from authorities.
Right. You know, unfortunately, I must say that since then, not a lot of things changed in Ukraine, yet some did change, and I'm always keen to point out on positive changes, which are results of people's uprising, not political reforms or actions of politicians. So, you know, in Eastern Europe still there is, of course, the question of even a fear, you know, the people might even feel afraid to go out in the street, take poster in their hands and write a slogan on that poster, because even such a trivial here act may cause someone term in jail, or once again losing a job, or, and becoming kind of an official enemy of the regimes. And Eastern European countries, and here I would count among them, I talk about Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. Population of those countries still suffer from, once again, a very basic lack of very basic rights, such as freedom of conscience, freedom of expression, freedom of manifestation. And that was also kind of this this feeling of suffocating from a very basic right of expressing yourself and having a voice was also for us a reason to start to act and to speak. And I will always confess, and I don't feel ashamed about that, and because I think that it can be useful for other people who want to engage and who are engaging right now. We did not know at the beginning where we want to go exactly. We did not know what we're going to do and how it should be done. We didn't have anybody to instruct us or to help us, or we didn't have any experience even. We just knew that the conditions in which we are put are wrong, and that we want to count on better future, and we want to demand at least this better future, and to make our voices sound loud, and to make our bodies being present in public space and noticed as free, and bodies that can decide for themselves, women who can decide on their own for their bodies, was an essential thing, and that was the beginning. And of course, this protest did not only put the light on women's issues and women's conditions in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine in particular, it put a light on dictatorial regimes in those countries. Because indeed, what we were doing, we were speaking out, plus with female voice, which made it double crime, if you want, in that part of the world. And so once again, for those protests with slogans and loud shouting of our messages, we had to pay sometimes very high price, which sometimes was, there was often a thought in our mind, well, is this a reason to stop? You know, when you're 21 years old and after such a protest of once again taking off your top and writing a slogan, freedom for political prisoners, like we did in Minsk in Belarus. After this, you were grabbed by a crowd of adult men, questioned overnight, and then the next morning brought to a forest and tortured. Of course, after such experience, you say to yourself, that's it, I can't continue anymore. I won't go any further, that's enough, it does not worth it. But then you understand after some time that indeed what we did now, we just revealed how those scary dictatorial regimes, how actually fragile they are. If they fear so much 3 topless girls. I mean, there was a group of around 20 adult men who spent with us 24 hours questioning us, torturing us, and all the most horrible things. That's their daily job, to make people afraid, people who dare to speak, to make them afraid. That's the context in which we began. And that's the kind of the experience that I carry with me, and that of course affected me for life, but that's also my story, that I think as a person, as an activist, as a young woman who can have a possibility to go and speak in front of others, I want to tell and express. And you know, when for example right now, including the situation here in Italy, in this country, or in other Western European countries, when people so easily go and vote for the right wing, for those who represent exactly similar vision of the world as those dictators in Eastern Europe, and do it so easily, I just want to go and tell them how it is there, so that you can really understand that sometimes one vote or one kind of feeling of, being disappointed with the current affairs of the world and willing to kind of punish the establishment by electing those who represent even worse conditions for your future, I mean, it can really affect everybody. So,
what's interesting about Ukraine, I mean, just to stay on the political side, what's interesting about Ukraine is that, of course, they're in the middle of presidential elections now. They've just gone through to the second round. I think in 2 weeks they have the final election. And one of the candidates is a former comedian, would you believe it? Which perhaps, in Italy we can relate to a little bit. Tell us the dynamic of that, because he also seems to be in a place like Ukraine, where, as you said, of course, freedom of speech, democracy is so hard to fight for. You have that situation. What do you think of how things are developing?
You know, in analyzing what's going on right now in Ukraine, of course, that's a subject on its own, and we would have a very long and, I think, profound discussion about the situation there. But just referring quickly to the candidate who is probably most likely to become a president, the next president of Ukraine, who is indeed a comedian, who, you know, on his shows and comedy shows, I grew up. I saw him on TV every day. He has no experience in politics. He neither has a really political vision or policy, at least he did not present it so far. And this is very frightening for someone like myself to observe that this is the people's choice. But on the other hand, I also understand people's choice. They simply do not want to give again another 5 years of their life in the hands of those politicians who destroyed their lives already for previous several decades. There are no other politicians. There is a comedian, and then there are 4 other candidates who have been ruling the country for the last decades, and including politicians who were part of the dictatorial regime of Yanukovych, the president who ran away after Maidan. So if you want, yeah, I have a mixed feeling. I'm frightened and afraid by the choice, but at the same time, I understand that people want to show that they want something else. They want a different future, and they are ready right now to say no to the establishment. So, of course, this vote for the comedian is the no to the establishment. But at the same time, of course, it will have consequences, direct consequences on lives of people as well. But what do you do when you're trapped between unexperienced comedian and experienced politicians, but experienced in destroying lives of people?
Obviously, you can't go back to Ukraine now. You're effectively in exile. You've been living in Paris. Tell us how that step happened and how you feel living in the West and the challenges, the different challenges for women that you see now as opposed to where you grew up.
You know, I would always kind of, I mean, I just already started talking about all the persecutions we experienced and all the terrible consequences we had, but I want to bring it into the positive thinking, and I learned a lot from those experiences. And from exile, I think, from being forced into exile during the regime of Yanukovych, in Ukraine, I received this opportunity, together with Femen movement, to go beyond the national borders and to expand our fight on an international level. And that's what happened. It's actually thanks to the exile and, you know, actually thanks to the president and to his regime who forced us out of Ukraine, we actually became even bigger and more powerful as a movement. And that's kind of the example of their counterproductive actions of those regimes. And on a personal level, of course, it's extremely difficult. And, you know, being a refugee is, you know, living in exile is extremely difficult experience. And plus, if you continue your political activism, of course, there is a lot of specificities that you just become kind of a routine for you, but which means that difficult experience become your routine. Living in France right now, well, being based in France and working with the movement on an international level, of course, makes me very proud. You know, even though I'm right now personally already kind of welcome next generation of feminine activists, and I think that street fight here is their fight now, and I'm there to assist, to help, to consult, to contribute to feminine fight in such ways like right now, talking to you directly. I look at this new generation of feminine activists, and I feel extremely proud that something that we started 10 years in Ukraine as a group of just unexperienced young female students who did not have a lot of understanding about political campaigning and where we're going to go, to see this growing up as an international movement, raising already at least one generation of women, because after a recent conference like this I had, one young woman came to me and she said, thank you so much, I grew up on Femen actions. And it was such a strange feeling. I was like, what do you mean you grew up on Femen actions? I'm just 28 years old, you know? But indeed, I felt very proud about that. And I think that once again, this exile and these persecutions that we face in Ukraine actually opened up the windows and doors for the movement, and it grew up and became international.
Now, a lot of people consider your tactics very controversial, and now, incredibly, Femen is more than 10 years old as a movement, probably, obviously, one of the most famous feminist movements in the world. But because your actions were seen as so controversial, and for some women, off-putting, you may have got the headlines, and you did, but do you think that sometimes that actually took away from the message, in the sense that there would be the picture in the paper of, you know, young, often beautiful girls, you know, crashing whatever thing you seem to aim at, but that actually the message behind it was sometimes lost?
You know, I think that, first of all, what I have to precise answering on this question is that I do not believe that there is one perfect form of feminism. Moreover, I do not believe that there should be one tactic and one form of feminism. And I think that feminism indeed can succeed only by convergence and numerous multiplicity of different tactics. And Femen's role here is indeed to make the headlines and to start the debates. And then later on, feminists and humanists with other tactics will follow on, and then it will continue, you know, reaching the other horizons of fight. Yet, yes, of course, our message have been very often presented as superficial or completely ignored, for example. And I have a privilege talking in front of many journalists, so of course, very often it's, you know, the interest in such protests was only the photo and not the message. And we ourselves had to fight it. I will tell you a funny and sad story. When we began our fight in Ukraine, one of the first topless protests, we did topless, and we had a poster above our head, and the text was only on the poster. And what we saw in several media is that the picture was cut. So they cut off the poster and just had our bare, you know, chest and hands up. We had to fight that as well. And then we put our slogans on our body and said, well, now you can't separate it. You can't separate my body from my message. So, of course, yes, I'm very, you know, open to recognize that very often, of course, since we play with this provocative image of a naked woman's body, and of course it can be sometimes taken on a, as the French say, avec le premier degré, like on the very low level, kind of very superficial level, and yet thankfully to intelligence of many journalists, it often went beyond, of course, that. Yet, yes, I'm always aware and kind of try to point out that indeed we were helped by media, we were built up also by media, yet we also became ourselves victims of our own mediatization. When journalists were no longer interested in the message we wanted to deliver, but were interested just now in a kind of backstory, or what's the story of that woman, what's her life, what's her job, what's her family, does she have a boyfriend? And so, of course, this is, I think, once again reveals that sexism is present even in the media. And we continue to resist these tendencies, and we continue to fight. And for example, we decided that we also gonna write our own texts, our own books. We publish now, written by our activists, 4 books in the last 2 years, which we took a responsibility to write directly our own word, which is behind many of those protests. Every opportunity I have to speak in front of people like this also gives us this opportunity to explain what's behind those photos, what's behind those slogans. And frankly speaking, you know, I also say that our first démarche was with this topless protest was to start the debates, to say that to say many things. Among them is that women's voices should be heard. And we were fighting in Ukraine, back in Ukraine, to have an opportunity to speak. And here we are. Now I have an opportunity to speak with you, and I'm very proud of it, and it's a result of those protests, which are considered by some controversial, yet we got our opportunity to speak out, and we have a message that we carry, and many people share it.
Well, I totally agree with you, first of all. I totally agree with you that there isn't one type of feminism, both ideology and also, it applies in different ways in different cultures. Femen have often targeted organized religion, not unsurprisingly, seeing as often there is organized sexism within it. Having said that, when in a country, let's say like Italy, where in the global gender gap, for the World Economic Forum, Italy is in the 70th position, 7-0 of gender parity out of, I think, 150. Let's put it this way, it's closer to Qatar than it is to France. So in a country like Italy that genuinely needs more female voices, to attack the Vatican in ways which many would consider offensive. So, the nudity and often the sort of the imagery, the icons of Catholicism. Don't you think it's naive to think that if you do that, that action will actually drown out any message, valid message, that you may have?
I think that it's naive to think that if we keep silence about religions and don't provoke debates, that we're gonna get rid of discrimination and medieval ideas. I think this is naive. And I think that provoking debates sometimes indeed needs to cross the borders built by institutions for us. And, the question of offense is always very interesting. And of course, it always comes on the stage and put on the table when we discuss religions. The question of offense, of being offensive towards believers. Whenever you criticize religion, religious dogma, religious institutions, religious leadership. Look, I'm a woman, I'm a feminist. I'm offended every day by sexist speech pronounced in Vatican, by sexist speech pronounced in the parliaments, in the streets. I'm offended every day. But nobody talks about feministophobia, right? Nobody's bothered about the feelings of feminists, feelings of women. We're offended. And I don't want anybody to be prevented from speaking out and expressing their ideas, even sexist ideas, because I'm offended. I think that the notion of offense is actually used to censor someone's speech. And I think it's a very dangerous notion for the society where we want to have open debates and hear different, diverse voices and understand that people can have very different priorities and very different things can bother them. As a woman, as a feminist, I am bothered by medieval ideas embodied in religions that are still preached. I am bothered by exclusively male leadership in religious institutions. I am bothered by the fact that many women indeed want to take leadership in those religious institutions, but they are banned simply because they are women and they cannot indeed have an equal part and participate in transforming or reinterpreting dogma and transforming the institution to making it more equal. So I think that once again, Femen's role here is to be this kind of, provocator. I think that provocation unjustly considered to be a negative, has a negative definition. To provoke a debate, we say. That's something necessary to begin the debate. And going on into the question of religion, I think that, we, society in the last years, and especially in the last year, have been very open and went really much further in public debates about women's issues and women's rights and the question of discrimination of women. And I think that we simply cannot keep silence if we want to continue to walk this path of progress, of women's rights, and fighting all forms of discrimination and male domination. We cannot continue keeping silence about discrimination against women in religions. We cannot continue. I mean, just listen to me. You might not agree with my provocations and my kind of radical voice against religion, but we just recently heard how many nuns went out and spoke about the abuses that they experienced in the church. The religious women who are part of those institutions. Isn't it already just this? Isn't it a reason to go for open debates about this? We just heard how many victims of sexual aggressions, of pedophilia spoke out. We hear how many women in other parts of the world from other religious traditions speak out about abuse and discrimination motivated by religious rule. So I think that indeed sometimes provocation is needed to begin the debates.
But it's... I think, you can really tell from the warmth of the audience and the loud applause, everyone really sort of respects. So there's just a few things, though, I feel I need to push because they're such difficult issues to deal with right now. I mean, you just mentioned the issues of nuns speaking out within the church. Obviously, we know a lot of other religious, in the Islamic world, there's a lot of women fighting, but I suppose they would say the issue isn't maybe so much with religion, it is with the way that it's interpreted, it is in the way that the institutions are being used against them. And so again, my question isn't just about whether it's bad to provoke, it's more about whether some of your tactics actually alienate some of the women who need it most. And I'm wondering whether you sort of do that and make your peace within the sense that, you can't help all the women all the time, you can't be one thing to all women, or whether you are thinking, 10 years into the movement, now you yourself are a little older, whether it's time to look back at the tactics of Femen and think, okay, we did that for 10 years, maybe now we could change tack a little bit.
Actually our tactics were changed and adopted and evolved not just 10 years after they should evolve, but they were permanently evolved. And I just gave you an example with poster, cut, and we decided to write on our bodies. So there was a permanent thinking about how we can become better. And right now we are also in this, it's a permanent, a reflection and being self-critical, of course. I absolutely, assume, and actually indeed I'm very proud of that some of Femen actions today do not have a same reactions, we don't get same reactions as 5 years ago. And we see that today in some actions, some contexts do not sparkle so much outrage because just naked body appears in public space with a poster, with a slogan, which means we're reaching our goal. We're changing perception of society about women's body, that it can be political and it's not shocking anymore. It's great. And I feel very proud about that. And of course, changing and adopting our tactic is once again one of the permanent priorities of Femen activists. And, yet we also see that still the question of women's body being this kind of a battlefield of where many patriarchal and sexist fights are staged and are going on, it's still relevant. And making this body appearing in front of the world as a fighting, as not passive but active, as not silent but screaming out loud, and as not smiling but and not there to please anybody but as angry, is still working and is still needed. And the proof will not be just my words or my own personal convictions, but right now we see how actually Femen tactic is right now way beyond the Femen movement itself. It's used right now by other activists in Argentina, in Australia. Recently in British Parliament a few days ago, people used Femen tactic to protest Brexit. The fact that the tactic and the idea of rebellious human body that carries the message in itself, being yourself a message, still works and still is relevant. So there is, for us is always for us a question is always how to be more efficient than we were yesterday, yet we do not consider that there is, at least for now, a case to give up this tactic as completely inefficient. And speaking about other cultures, you mentioned other cultures. Look, we were always very often told that it's something, using naked woman's body, taking off your clothes can work only in Western cultures. Or, you know, for example, we were, of course, told many times that this is something not for Arab countries or Islamic countries. And I just want to bring your attention to the protests that are going on right now in Iran, where women take off their headscarf and kind of, with this act, point out on oppressive, discriminative, absolutely totalitarian laws imposed on every woman just because she's a woman, regardless of their confession. They do not check whether you're Muslim or you're not. Every woman, just because you're in woman's body, have to cover herself. And those women take off their scarf and manifest publicly their hair in the wind and their kind of bare heads. And this is exactly the same philosophy of claiming ownership of my own body. They do not need to be topless there, indeed. They do not need. But taking it off and saying, I want to decide whether I'm going to wear it or I'm going to taking it off, and not the law, not the clerics, not the mullahs, not the government, but me, I'm going to decide. It's exactly the same philosophy, exactly the same idea. I own my body, and I decide when my body will be sexual, when it will be political. Not priests, not imams, not rabbis, not politicians, not presidents. Nobody else is going to decide for me.
So just to pick up on a reference that you made there about the Femen tactics used in the British Parliament. Basically, a few days ago, after some Brexit vote, we've all lost track of which one it was about 5 or 6 people in the gallery that stripped down naked. And so in the pictures, you could see, like, with messages on their body, which was basically the most sensible thing that's come out of the British Parliament in a couple of months. So that was interesting to see the Femen tactics used there. But it seems to me, when you make the example of Iran, that you are sort of conceding that the core feminine tactic of nudity, I guess, wouldn't work in some countries because the mere act of almost showing your hair almost has the same shock value of showing your breasts in the rest of the world. So is that like a change of the feminine tactic, or do you see it as the same thing?
I see it exactly the same philosophy, as I said. I mean, the goal is not to make everybody naked. Look, I'm in front of you right now, I'm not naked. I don't need to be naked, right? So that's not the goal. The goal is to claim claim the ownership over our own bodies, to deliver this message once again to the patriarchal culture and every representative of it, that I'm going to decide, I'm going to make a decision for myself, for my hair, for my chest, for my body. I'm going to decide when my body is political, when it's sexual. You know, we're right now in 2019. We're talking about amazing progresses in the question of women's rights. We talk about it, and meanwhile, in some countries, women still fight for their right to have their hair in the wind, if they want to, right? So the thing is that, you know, whether in my country of birth, in Ukraine, the country of third world level of poverty, the country with disastrous sex industry, human trafficking, devalorization of women, or in the country of my exile, in France, the prosperous developed country, the land of feminism, with the slogan liberté, laïcité, égalité, fraternité, plus laïcité. In those two countries, woman's body is still, on different levels, in different contexts, is still considered as a sex object. We are still fighting this fight over ownership of woman's body. It's still a priority of modern feminism.
I mean, it goes well beyond the hair. I mean, of course, there's female genital mutilation that's still practiced. You know, if we're talking about rights in a lot of parts of the world, a woman doesn't have the right to her own children, which, of course, would pretty much trump everything else. I mean, basically, this is a discussion about feminism. And I've seen in the picture, at least in the English version of the Perugia Festival, this one, you're wearing a T-shirt that says feminist. Now, interestingly, in Italy, I'm sure many of you will relate, sometimes in TV debates, there are people that use the word feminist as an insult, effectively. Do you think that the word itself has been, in a way, coerced into being something else, into being or seeming something extreme that again alienates people, or do you think that's changed? And I'm assuming that you do describe yourself as a feminist.
Of course, I claim that. It's my second name. But I will tell you honestly and again confess, maybe for those who doubt right now whether they are feminist or not, and whether they would associate themselves to this word or not. Back in Ukraine in 2009, we had these debates about, are we going to proclaim ourselves feminist movement or women's movement to escape exactly this word feminism? We feared it. We were not sure. We knew about negative connotation, negative definition of this word. And indeed, after some time we understood that, well, the negative definition that was ringing in our head was the definition of our opponents, of those people we're going to fight. Of course, feminism as a word has a lot of misconceptions. It's very often portrayed as a caricatural kind of word, and of course very often feminists are humiliated just for saying feminism and kind of laughed at. Yet, what is, whether feminism is it something radical, is it something wrong, is it something negative, is it something extreme? Very often I'm asked those questions. If an idea that women are equal to men is radical, negative, and extreme, I'm fine to be radical, ridiculous, negative, and extreme. I'm fine with that. If an idea that I own my body, that I am responsible for my proper choices, that I want to claim my right to speak out, my right to decide, my right to have choices over my body is ridiculous, negative, and extreme, I'm fine with that.
In the past 10 years since you've been active with Femen, but also, since you became an adult, really, have you noticed a change, positive or negative? How have you seen, it's difficult around the world, but just around you, how have you seen things change for women?
I told you today in the morning that I'm a dreamer, and I think that you cannot be an activist and fight for a better world without being a little bit a dreamer and living a little bit with utopias in your mind, and maybe being also a maximalist. And it's all I am. And the thing about, how I see the changes and the progress of feminism, I indeed appreciate numerous fights that feminists around the world, in their own little communities, in their own countries, and on the global scale altogether achieved. And indeed, the women's revolution, I consider women's revolution not to be just one specific period in history. I think that women's revolution is the longest of all human revolutions. And it goes on. It's a permanent fight. And recently, we had indeed a lot of achievements. Of course, every time we make one step forward, there are those who drag us behind and want to make several steps back. And it's historical fact. Whenever the society progresses and makes a progressive step forward, there is always a backlash. So what's happening, for example, recently what happened in Verona, here, right, in Italy, this Congress, infamous Congress, or what's happening in some of the European parliaments when we hear what the leaders are saying about women's rights, about abortion rights, is a backlash on the progresses that feminists did, that women did. And I think that, for example, the Verona Congress is a backlash and a sign of fear of those conservatives, because right now, even women from the church, nuns, are coming out with their powerful voices and speak out against discriminations. They want to be part of this institution. They want to defend their beliefs. I mean, their beliefs are legitimate. Their faith, their spirituality is absolutely legitimate. Yet they come out today, they feel empowered by other feminists, by fellow women who fought other fights, maybe even who fight religions like myself. But those women from the church come out because they feel empowered, they feel that their voice should exist. And I think that those progresses are enormous. And I really ask you to appreciate them and to support every woman who takes the courage to speak out.
I'm going to ask you one tiny last question, and then after that I'm going to open to questions. So please, get your questions ready, and we've got people with microphones that will come to you. Just final point for me, what next for you?
Next is continuing the longest of all revolutions, women's revolution. Practically speaking about what's next actions, we never share our plans because you can imagine we would never be able to attack Berlusconi if he would know that we're going to attack him, right? Yet, I'm right now releasing a book in France, a next book, celebrating indeed heroic women from very different backgrounds, including religious. That's kind of my homage to all female fighters who are often ignored, forgotten, and silenced. Our branches continue to develop, our movement continues to grow, and I think that if, for example, 6 years ago, our goal and our challenge was how to build an international movement, today I'm tending to think how to expand it beyond this international organized movement into a global movement, because indeed we see that the tactic is serving numerous different causes, and I think once again that Femen went much beyond the movement itself, the structure that we managed to build, and so now is probably our time to open up and go from international into the global.
Inna, thank you. Okay, so we started late, so we're going to stick around for another 15 minutes. And it's time for questions. So if I could have, if anyone has any questions for Inna? There's one over there. We could get the mic there. Put your hands up for other ones so I can see just for later as well.
Hi, this is not a question, it's just something I wanted to say. When you were saying that maybe some women feel alienated by her ways of showing her fight. And personally, I think that these women who feel alienated might be part of the problem. If a woman that manifests her feminism through her body, and that's the only way she can be heard, is a problem for these women who are, I don't know, shocked, I think those women are reiterating the patriarchy. They're again pointing at the ways she's protesting and they're not listening to the protest. So as a woman, I think I would feel ashamed. Sorry, because this woman here, with her body, she actually suffered and she fucking went through things that you can't even imagine, and I'm only thankful. And if that's her way, sorry, I want to support her as a woman.
Thank you.
And I don't want to condemn her. That's my feeling.
Thank you.
I'm not sure anyone was condemning her, but there are a lot of women who also suffer very much, who just would find this behavior alienating, and it's just something that I put to Inna.
I mean, that's thank you very much for the comment, but indeed, this idea of feeling alienated, what does it mean feeling alienated? Yeah, if you do not want to do such a protest or use such tactic, absolutely fine, and that's absolutely legitimate position. But attacking a fellow woman for claiming that she owns her body, indeed, there is a big problem with that. Because yes, we were criticized by some women who consider themselves feminists and who say, well, what you do is you sexualize woman's body even more because you expose it. So how come in a feminist mind, exposing woman's body means by definition appearing sexual, which this means that in her mind, woman's naked body is by definition sexual. That's not the feminist vision, that's a patriarchal vision. They want us by definition to be sexual, that indeed there is a problem in this thing.
Any other questions or comments? Up here at the front. Can we get a mic here? It's coming.
Hi. I don't really know how it works, so my question is, if you were ever allowed to go back to Ukraine, would you physically yourself bring your fight back to Ukraine? And could we ever dream of seeing you as the president of the Ukraine and try and make things better? Because, you know, I think it would be great as a president. And
after the comedian, right?
After the comedian. I mean, let's say the comedian allows you to go back. Would you ever bring your fight back over there?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I couldn't go back to Ukraine since I went into exile in 2012. If I would go back, and I hope very soon I will, and once I'm able, I will go back, at least visit and go there. Femen movement right now restarted its work in Ukraine with other activists that, you know, the women, it's a new generation again of Ukrainian women who fight in Ukraine. To be honest, right now I tend to say that if I would go back, I would probably not go back topless, but with a white shirt and black skirt and really head towards the parliament, at least I think so.
Any other... There we go.
Hi. I want to ask if you know the movement, I'm sure you know it, the movement Non una di meno, Ni una menos. What do you think about, how do you positionate about the movement? Thanks.
Thank you. Of course, I know the movement. We closely follow the fights, and you know, I think that this movement is one of the recently most powerful voices of feminism, feminist voices, and you know, for us, we indeed were in contact with numerous women from Argentina in France. Who came also for public speaking, who shared their fight, who presented us the green scarves. And, you know, I think that the only thing, of course, we can do and we can feel as and express is a total and absolute unconditional solidarity with those women, and we are we were extremely proud when we received messages and videos from some of the activists from the topless protest in front of the churches too, that was staged in Argentina. And you know, I think that obviously the message carried by this movement is one of the most important messages, that still women in the world are dying because they are women, only because they are women. And this issue is not only the issue in Latin America, this issue is the issue in Europe too, because the numbers of feminicide and domestic violence are, in Europe are extremely outrageous, horrifying. And this movement is a voice, an important voice in current debates, because indeed sometimes some issues and some questions are ignored, forgotten or considered as minor. But indeed women in the world continue dying just because they're women. So big solidarity and greetings to every woman fighting there.
Yeah. There's a question here.
Yes, I'd like to ask you about the next generation, not just of young feminists, but young women. We know that Malala was shot in the head for advocating for education for girls, and Greta Thunberg is constantly criticized for speaking out about the environment. So what is the role of young girls in feminism right now, and is there a role for young boys as well? Thank you.
Thank you. You know, I have an amazing hope for the next generations, because really looking at already political leaders like Greta, for example, she is a political leader already. Looking at this young generation women who are building their own movements without censored, without any political support or specific tools. They have their own movement. They represent an alternative power already today. So indeed, I do think that women can change the world, and they are changing. And I think that more and more young female leaders are going to rise up, and we're all going to follow them. And I think that it's extremely, extremely important to support women like her. Yet, of course, you mentioned the attacks that she's subjected to, Malala and all others. We all share the same experience from the point of view that whenever you try to speak out, you have to be ready for an avalanche of attacks. Because yet, such a simple thing as speaking with woman's voice is an outrageous still for many, many, many people. And especially, you know, because indeed women's voices that are speaking out are tending to speak out the messages that are against the current male favoring system. And of course, they're going to be opposed. And you know, I think that once again, it's a responsibility of everybody to stand behind those young female leaders and simply, you know, support and be with them and carry their fight. And the most important also is the responsibility of each of us to raise those girls as leaders with the idea that you can become that leader. You know, if we speak right now, how many leaders we can name girls? Indeed, there are some, we know some known, but we can just count them still on fingers of two hands, right? So raising new generations of girls with an idea that they can lead, that they can become the owners of their own lives and also the leaders of this world is very important. And raising up the boys with an idea that they don't have to kind of guide girls or be leaders or guardians or be more powerful, less emotional than girls, this is also something extremely important, and it's going to change the world. I think that this kind of gendered education is absolutely an outdated thing that damaged indeed a lot of generations and still continues to damage our common lives. So yes, let's go for more empowered girls and more tolerant, empowered boys that can compete with girls on equals.
Inna Shevchenko, thank you so much. Thank you.